Terrific. So, good evening, good evening, good evening, and it's very, very good to see you all. I'm being confused by something. Right, okay, so good evening, and it's really, really good to see you all. There are a lot of people here who are what I would describe as faithful followers of Speak Up for Our Planet, and there are also lots of new people, so that's absolutely superb, and a very warm welcome to all of you. This is the we've been running Speak Up for Our Planet for 6 months now. The launch webinar was 6 months ago, and this is our 10th event, so that's quite exciting, I think. Our purpose is to encourage people to think about and learn about and spread the word about environmental matters, climate change, and the ways in which we can help to protect the resources of our planet. Now, because there are quite a lot of new people here, I'm actually going to just take a moment to share information about Speak Up for Our Planet and the website address and the contact details, because some of you have just been given the link to today's talk and won't know anything about the background. So if you'll just forgive me for one moment, I'm just going to share some slides, only 2. Get the bit that I want, slideshow. That's won't do it for me. Never mind. So Speak Up for Our Planet is it's a website with a lot of information on it, but if you want to know about what the events are that are coming up, you need to go to the events page. So there on this page you have the website address, the events page address, and the email address. So if you want to get onto the mailing list, if you've got questions, suggestions, anything of that kind, please use that email address. You could take a photograph of this slide, or you could do a print screen of it or something so that you've got that information. And there are 3 events already in the calendar coming up. The 7th of April, we've got a guy coming to tell us about what grants are available if you want to do environmental things like, I don't know, putting solar panels on your roof or anything of that kind, and what's available in terms of government grants. And on the 12th of May, we're having a guy coming to talk to us about energy efficient homes, insulation, all that kind of thing. So the reason I put stars beside those 2 is because they actually link really well with each other. And in between them, we've got a guy from Colorado who's coming to talk to us about COP26. And if you don't know what COP26 is, go and look at the website, because there's a lot of information on there about it. So that's all I'm going to do in terms of sharing my slides, because what you've come for is to hear Daphne Billuri-Grant, who is sitting here ready and waiting. She is speaking to you from Aberdeen. She's a member of the Aberdeen Rotary Club. She's been...
Sorry, Jane, St Andrews.
St Andrews, I really beg your pardon. It begins with A. St Andrews, thank you very much indeed. She's been a sustainability advisor pretty much all her career, and as she was pointing out a few minutes ago, everybody else suddenly seems to have started getting interested in it about 5 minutes ago. And one of the most challenging sectors is the fashion industry, so she's taken a particular interest in that. So with that, I would like to hand you over to Daphne to speak to us. So very, very warm welcome, Daphne.
Thank you very much, Jane. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight and share this presentation with all of you. I suppose a lot of you will be asking why the fashion industry and why we should be talking about it. But I think the sector has really caught my attention mainly for 2 reasons. Firstly, because of its immense growth over the past decade and the emergence of fast fashion that led to the fashion industry becoming one of the most polluting industries on a global scale. And secondly, because being one of the main industries, it also remains unregulated. So as a result, we're faced with two challenges, which makes the need for change even more of a priority. I'm going to share now my screen. I hope it all goes well to start the PowerPoint. I hope that's okay with everyone. Yeah, perfect. I just wanted to highlight that the main issue that I'd like to concentrate on tonight is talk about what are the environmental and social impact of the fashion industry, well, primarily fast fashion, but also what we all can do as individuals. So what does fast fashion mean? This is a definition that is widely used and has been used for several years now. Fast fashion is a fairly recent phenomenon, and it really emerged in the early 2000s, and it's really been embedded, I would say, since 2010. It has dramatically changed the landscape within the industry, and it's responsible for making the fashion industry one of the biggest polluters on a global scale. For example, fashion companies have increased their offerings from what it used to be 2 collections on an annual basis in 2000 to 5 collections by 2011. So it's estimated that clothing production has roughly doubled since 2000, with the average consumer now purchasing 70% more garments than they did 20 years ago. So it's quite impressive if you think about it in numbers of how much things have changed over just 2 decades. So what does that mean for the environment? There are really 3 main areas where we see major impact, and that's plastic pollution, carbon emissions, and water quality and consumption. As you can see from this slide, again, it's quite shocking if you think about that a truckload of clothes is going into landfill or is being incinerated every second. Currently, the fashion industry is considered the second biggest polluter in terms of plastic pollution after the fishing industry. It is responsible for almost 36% of global plastic pollution, and due to its unsustainable methods of production, it has an overarching, very negative impact on the environment. And one of the main factors for this is the fact that the type of textiles that are being used. I don't know if you're aware, but the majority of the clothes that most people wear nowadays are actually made of plastic. Since man-made synthetic fibers were introduced in the 1940s, and polyester being the most popular and the most well-known, that's really has dominated the textile sector and inevitably the fashion industry. There is a website called Good For You, and it provides a lot of information about the fashion industry. And one of the things they highlight is that polyester annual production is currently exceeding 52 million metric tons on a global scale. So it shows again how the introduction of such a synthetic fiber has allowed the fashion industry to boom in such a short period of time. And again, this slide, I just want to highlight to you the sizable impact of textiles. So why polyester is bad for the environment? I think polyester is found approximately in about 70% of all our garments that are being produced. It produces 3 times more carbon emissions than cotton, and it doesn't break down when it goes to landfill, where it usually has a lifespan of up to 200 years. It's also responsible for the amount of microplastics that we find now in our oceans. So every time we wash a garment, that is made out of polyester or other synthetic fibers, we're actually releasing plastic microfibers into our waterways, which inevitably end up in our oceans and damage marine life and ecosystem. So it is estimated that overall polyester is responsible for over 35% of the current microplastics that exist in our oceans. It's also important to note that the production of polyester alone is very much reliant on the oil industry. So it means also that fossil fuels are being used to make clothes, and that production is a very energy intensive process. Requires a large amount of petroleum. It releases a lot of particulate matter and acids into the atmosphere. What I want, obviously, this is one of the main environmental impacts of fast fashion. The other thing that we need to remember is that fast fashion is also responsible for carbon emissions. And I mentioned earlier with Jane, we were discussing that it's the well-known fact that the fashion industry is responsible for 10% of all carbon emissions worldwide, which is more than the aviation and the maritime transportation industry combined, which again is quite an impactful amount of carbon emissions. According to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, emissions from the textile manufacturing alone are projected to skyrocket by 60% by 2030, which again, there is no sign of actually decreasing the amount of clothes, the amount of textiles that are being produced. Here, this is taken up from the Enviro Audit Committee, so it concentrates on what it is, the UK consumption of per person, which actually the UK is the highest in Europe, with 26.7 kilos of clothing that we get rid of on an annual basis. The average is estimated at about 15 kilos. So we're almost double in terms of the UK. But then looking at other countries like the US, where actually you're looking at about 36 kilos per person on an annual basis. Again, that showcases how much more clothing is being getting rid of on an annual basis. The other thing, the final point is about the environmental impact is the use of water. At the bottom, you can see there that 3,781 liters of water are being used to create a pair of jeans. That again showcases the amount of water that needs to be used for fiber production, especially for fibers like cotton, and the destruction of the water quality because of dyeing and finishing. The fashion industry is the second largest consumer of water. It seems to have on the top two, the second biggest plastic polluter, the second largest consumer of water. And so as an example, a single cotton t-shirt uses enough drinking water to sustain one human being for 3 years, which is the equivalent of 2,700 liters. So if you think about that and you multiply by 20 garments per person, 7.7 billion people, then you're looking at the magnitude of the problem. As a reference, it can take up to 200 tons of fresh water to produce 1 ton of dyed fabric. And it's the textile dyeing that is the second worst polluter of water worldwide. Because the water that's left over through the dyeing process is often dumped into ditches, streams, rivers, as you can see here. This photo is taken from South Asia. So we are seeing an increased use of these type of materials that actually has a detrimental impact on the waterways. But fast fashion, aside from the environmental issues, also has quite significant societal issues, especially for the developing world. According to Remake, which is a prominent NGO looking into the social impact of the fashion industry, it is estimated that 80% of clothing is made by young women between the age of 16 and 22. And there are really 3 main areas that we're going to look at in terms of the social impact. The fashion industry has been identified as the most labor-dependent industry. And it's estimated that 1 in 6 people actually work within the fashion industry on a global market. And as a majority of the textile creation and garment production takes place in what we call the global south, this is driven by cheap labor, forced labor, extensive tax breaks, lack of stringent legal and regulatory systems, which allow to perpetuate the issue. It was in 2018 that there was a US Department of Labor report that found evidence of forced and child labor in several countries, such as Argentina, Bangladesh, Brazil, Turkey, China, India, Philippines, and that's to name a few, but also showcases that production of materials is being prioritized over human welfare. However, trying to buy clothing that is made locally isn't always ethical either. So when you're looking at a garment and you think, oh, it's made in Bangladesh, I'm not going to buy it, but I'll buy something that is made in the UK. Again, that is not necessarily the best choice, because as we've seen more recently, there is sweatshops in the developed countries as well. Recent example of the Boohoo factory in Leicester, where we started a UK investigation. There's also sweatshops throughout the US where demonstrate that buying local isn't necessarily the solution. People are often forced to work without fair pay, no overtime pay, they're under unacceptable working conditions, they're faced with health and safety breaches, such as lack of access to clean water, lack of proper ventilation, unsanitary restrooms. So all of these, all of these showcases that garment makers are actually not being taken seriously, not taken into consideration. It is estimated that for each worker, because they get paid on what they call a piece rate, so it's usually 2 pence per garment that they sew and they prepare. So it's impossible for them to be able to earn a fair living wage, but also shows that if it costs 2p to create that t-shirt, then that shows what is the actual value and how much of a profit the companies are making from those garments. So what can we do? How can we implement change? Self-regulation, obviously, it's essential. I think it's essential in every industry, so it has to be seen that it's happening within the fashion industry as well. Companies need to take responsibility. They need to design, test, and create business models that will allow clothes to be reused and will maximize the usefulness and within the lifespan. For example, Stella McCartney as a brand has been very vocal about the need for self-regulation, and has been working with other brands globally to try and create a regulatory body within the industry. There are certain retailers like Adidas who've experimented with creating personalized gears in order to be able to cut down the returns and also to cut down people wanting to buy more and more items. And also it's about increasing customer satisfaction while reducing basically their inventory. Ralph Lauren also has announced recently that they're going to be 100% sustainably sourced by 2025. And another solution is also renting clothes, which is becoming a way to contain the market. So you have companies like a US-based Rent the Runaway and Queenie Bee, or the UK-based Girl Meet Dress, which allow you to rent clothes and return them, or even just swap them for other items. But as with any other industry, it's also evidence that major changes towards sustainable practices need to happen on a national level. So this is where we need to see more action from national governments. Right now, there's not really an effective regulatory system, and it's already been indicated that because the fashion industry overall is completely unregulated, national governments are also reluctant to try and push certain rules, regulatory processes to be able to deal with the fashion industry's damaging effects. A recent example in the UK was the fact that several members of parliament trying to bring to the ministers an option to address the environmental effects of fast fashion, and that was unfortunately turned down. On the other hand, you have successful attempts, like for example in France, where President Macron was able to create a pact of 150 brands to work together and make fashion industry more sustainable. So you have different perceptions and different ways that governments work. When we're looking on an international level, I suppose the UN has been the most progressive in that sense and the most proactive. They launched the Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, and their aim was to address the damages caused by fast fashion. Its aim is to halt environmentally and socially destructive practices of fashion. And along that initiative, there's other initiatives such as Conscious Fashion Campaign, which works in partnership with the UN. And their aim is to be able to allow the fashion industry to meet the UN Sustainability Development Goals by 2030. I'm very much an advocate of collaboration, and I really believe that effective collaboration within the industry, but also with other stakeholders outside the industry, will be the only way to be able to see a quick response and have more of a concrete results in terms of implementing transformational change. And while we talk about a top-down approach, it's also important to look at what can we do from the bottom up. And I think that's where the second part of this presentation is to talk about how we all as individuals can make a difference. So what can we do, or what can you do to make a difference? This is a question that I actually get it. A lot of people ask me that question all the time, because there's a sense that because fashion is seen as something periodic, trendy, that there's perception that not everybody should be involved with what is happening, and they don't see that there's many ways of how they can help. But first and foremost, and I think for everyone, is, it's about educating. It's educating ourselves, educating the people around us, and being able to spread the word. We need to educate ourselves about what does it mean? What are the implications of fast fashion? How do we address the issue of overconsumption that's reflected throughout this industry? And it's also about learning to love our clothes, respect what we own, and be able to stop viewing clothes as a disposable item. So these are some of the pointers I always like to suggest to people. First of all, it's about buying less. Less is the new black, so less is always more, as they say nowadays. But it is about lowering our consumption of clothes. The current pattern of fast fashion is about constantly buying, over-consuming in a sense, and creating increased waste, which, as I highlighted earlier, it's almost impossible to manage. With almost 85% of used clothes ending up in landfills or being incinerated, it means that it's no longer possible to sustain that kind of disposable model. When clothes remain in a landfill up to 200 years, then obviously there will be no more space to be able to absorb all that amount of clothing. The other thing that we all can do is revisit your wardrobe. It's about making sure you hand over, sell items that you no longer wear. So make it useful for somebody else, or identify a way that you can, find a new home for those items, because the worst thing you can do is actually throwing it away. For those items that you want to hold on, it's making sure that you wear them, and wear them more than a couple of times. Right now, it's estimated that a new piece of clothing is only worn 2 to 3 times before it's being disposed. Again, that's an indication of the Instagram generation, where you wear things a couple of times and then you get rid of it. So it's recommended that we wear each item at least 100 times to be able to showcase that you've given it a long life. It's also about creating a capsule wardrobe, so maintaining 40 or 50 items that you carry for life in that sense. It's one of the best ways to reduce your fashion footprint. And also remembering that when you wash your clothes, it's good to use a washing machine bag, so it filters the fibers that don't end up in our waterways in terms of microplastics. Donating clothes to a charity is not always the best solution, because a lot of people think, I don't need this anymore, therefore I'm just going to give it to my local charity. Because charity shops actually can only sell about 20% of the received donations. The rest, again, it's either landfilled, incinerated, or is being sent to other countries, usually in the global south. A large portion of that exported clothing actually ends up in waste as well, so it does end up in landfill. For example, in Ghana, which is considered the largest second-hand market in the world, they estimate that almost 40% of the clothing they receive is actually discarded. So This is the things you can do with your own clothes. And of course, repairing your clothes that you have, mending, borrowing, swapping clothes with friends and family. It's, you know, it's just a way to be able to update your wardrobe. But what happens if you actually want to buy a new item? Then if you want to buy something new, think about shopping secondhand or actually using a swap shop. These are affordable and probably the best ways to have a more sustainable wardrobe. There's so many online options nowadays that when it comes to vintage clothing, when it comes to swap shops for all types of clothing, from, you know, really basic clothes to really high fashion. So there's anything and everything that you want to find. So a simple way to reduce your footprint is ensuring that you use that type of companies. It's also about ensuring that when you do shop online, that you only buy the things that you need. Not because there's a trend where a lot of people buy 4 or 5 items knowing that they're only going to keep one, but they want to try them and see what works best. But actually what has been estimated by the World Bank is that 40% of clothing that's been purchased and then sent back ends up in landfill again, or is being incinerated. It never goes back into the market for a resale. So that's important to remember when you do shop for clothes. The other thing is buying from sustainable brands. Remake, which is the NGO I mentioned earlier, actually they have a directory of sustainable brands online, so you can identify the ones that work for you. Again, it covers all types of clothing on all price ranges. Greenwashing is prevalent, I think, in the fashion industry, so you really have to be careful about what is presented as environmentally or sustainable. A recent report by the European Commission has found that 42% of green claims by companies actually was either false, deceptive, or exaggerated. So, and also remember that a higher price tag doesn't necessarily mean that that company is actually has paid more for the garments they produced, or it's been created in a more environmentally responsible manner. And when you do buy clothes, make sure that you buy clothes made from sustainable fibers. The best way, they say, it's actually trying to promote clothing made out of wild silk, organic cotton, linen, hemp, or lyocell. These are the best fibers to work with. And for garments that you're using, for example, for active wear, so normally you would be looking at synthetic fibers for that. Again, it's better to opt for recycled material. The use of sustainable and recycled textiles also allows the industry to promote a better way of dealing with materials. And it's also to remember that there's plenty of textiles out there that it's been estimated that we don't actually need to produce virgin textiles. There is plenty of material out there to be used for any new collection or more new clothes to be sewn together. One of the other things I'm highlighting there is about boycotting brands. It's about holding brands accountable for what they're doing. So it's demanding brands to be able to pay up for the workers. ASOS, Urban Outfitters, I'm just giving you a couple of examples, were recently being implicated in a lot of scandals in terms of the payment of their workers, as well as environmental infractions. So it's highlighting to brands like that they need to act in relation to what they're doing. They're also remembering that a lot of your favorite brands are the ones that are widely used and consumed, like Zara, Uniqlo, H&M, Topshop. They're equally responsible, and they're very prevalent in sourcing the use of cotton or promoting forced labor. It is estimated that about 23% of brands disclose how I suppose they don't disclose how the product has been made and what type of workforce have they used. So by boycotting these brands, you're actually forcing them to be able to operate more ethically and more environmentally responsibly. Only reputational risk, I suppose, on the supply chain can actually force these brands to change the way they operate. The pandemic crisis has actually shown that the situation has been much more difficult. And a lot of, actually when it happened last March, a lot of major brands canceled their orders coming from the global south. Example, again, I'm using is the Arcadia Group that canceled orders worth over £100 million by June 2020. The implication of that, of course, was that thousands of workers never got paid. They laid off masses of workers, both in the UK as well as in other countries. And finally, it's about getting involved, engaging with NGOs, organizations that are involved in the fashion industry, and reaching out to your government officials, emailing companies, questioning them about the way they operate, and donating or volunteering your time for labor rights organizations and NGOs that promote sustainable fashion. I've given there a couple of examples at the bottom for you to see. It's about engaging organizations like this and making sure that they can help or they can promote these changes. Overall, I suppose a final point to say is that it is about education, and it is about changing our attitude and how we shift from overconsumption to using clothing not just for convenience or just to express ourselves, but actually because we need it. Go back to, I suppose, when I grew up, where clothes is about, it was functional in one way, but also it was, you had a long-term relationship with your clothes. So that is the end of my presentation. So I would welcome some questions, and I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Perfect. Thank you.
Daphne. Wow, that was a lot of information.
So hope I didn't scare everybody off.
I suspect that you're probably going to be bombarded with questions. So I'm going to change the view on my screen so I can see as many people as possible. Please, if you have a question, you have two ways of doing it. You can wave your hand in the air, or you can put it in the chat. Putting it in the chat's probably more reliable because I've got two screens here and I won't be able to see everybody. So please go ahead if you have any questions, chat or wave at me. Well, I've got a question just to kick us off. I used to really enjoy buying clothes from, they were sort of second-hand designer shops. So I got a big kick out of buying clothes that should have been really, really expensive for about 20 quid because they'd been owned by somebody before. But these shops all disappeared. And I presume they disappeared because the rates on the high streets where they were just too high to sustain with the business they were doing. So are those sorts of shops now online? Are there shops like that are selling sort of, quite high class clothes, but having been around the mill a couple of times? Do you know of any of those?
Yes, I think everything has kind of, well, not just because of the pandemic, but over the past 5 years, I think a lot of this type of clothing has moved online. And it is because, like you said, it's too costly to have a physical presence on the high street. And it's much more accessible, both in terms of location, because, you just order it online, so it doesn't really matter where you are based. There is a massive market in second-hand clothing, and it is very much, it's a big market, especially for the high end, because you can get designer clothes at a very reasonable price. And it is not necessarily second-hand. It's actually a lot of the time it's overabundance of product, actually. So it's they've been overproduced. So instead of just selling it as they would, because they need to sell it within a collection, once the collection is out of date, you can still buy it for a fraction of the price. Some big brands, for example, Louis Vuitton, that got into trouble last year, they refuse to do that. So what they do, they prefer to actually incinerate all their stock that is left over. And they've been fined in France heavily.
Who did you say that was?
Louis Vuitton.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So they and Burberry is the same. So they prefer to burn the clothes instead of reselling them because they feel that it takes away the value of the brand. But what the government has done, well, the French government is actually hitting them with massive fines to prevent them from doing that. And I think gradually they're changing that.
Okay, lots of questions in the chat now. You didn't mention wool in your sustainable textiles. Is there any reason for that?
Yes, because it's not sustainable, I'm afraid.
Okay.
So yes, the production of wool actually has been considered. It needs a lot of water. So yes, it's not considered a sustainable material. The same thing as cotton, unless you use organic cotton, which uses less water, but what we call the normal cotton that you get is not sustainable.
But presumably they're still better than plastic, are they, or not necessarily?
Not necessarily,
okay.
No, unfortunately.
Same. Okay. Gwyneth says, there's not a single UK company approved on the Remake website. What do we do if we don't want to order from abroad?
Remake website, I think it has it by regions. Last time I checked, they do have a UK section. Yes, you don't want, again, because it is an environmental issue, you don't want transportation from across the Atlantic for something to order in the UK. There is the same thing with all the secondhand shops. The ones I've put up on the presentation, like the Depop, Vinted, all of these are UK-based online shops, so you can purchase your clothes through there. Equally in the States and Canada, they've got their own group of brands that people can shop from there. So it's really good to make sure that you use brands that are accessible within your region, i.e. in Europe and the UK, as opposed to the other way around. Yeah.
Can definitely recommend where we can find a list of ethical and sustainable clothing brands.
So Remake is probably the most comprehensive directory of sustainable brands is on the website of Remake. They're amazing as an organization. They've been doing amazing work, both primarily started for social rights of workers for the Global South, but over the past few years, they've really promoted more environmental issues and the impact of fast fashion. And they've been engaging with other NGOs as well as with governments. And I've been actually working closely with them on a couple of issues. And yeah, they're a great source of information.
There's also something which I have actually put up on the Speak Up for Our Planet website, but not necessarily very many people have found it. There's a thing called Ethical Consumer, which is, it's like Which, Which with the question mark after it, which sort of helped you to find the best washing machine and all that kind of stuff. Ethical Consumer does the same thing, but so you can search for things which are being made ethically, and they do all the hard work and the research and everything for you. I found them very useful. You can buy all kinds of things through them, including clothes. Kate Burton says Oxfam does offer some high quality secondhand clothing, including bridal.
Yes, they do. If you are to think about charity shops, the only two I would recommend that they don't fall into the sort of like the gap of 20% of clothing being sold is Oxfam and the British Heart Foundation, because they have a really good supply chain system and they are really good at either moving the donated clothes they have within their own shops around the UK or taking it abroad and ensuring that it gets resold. So their supply chain is excellent. Oxfam has been brilliant, both in terms of high quality clothing, and I know they've created now a separate line for bridal. Actually, I donated my wedding dress to them several years ago. Yes, they're probably the best to look at, Oxfam and British Heart Foundation.
That's good to know. Okay, another question. What about the use of banana fibers? My uncle in India, this is not me, this is the person asking the question. My uncle in India is working on this, but there's a reluctance for funding.
There is a lot of interest about fibers coming out of natural produce like banana. Mushroom is really big right now. I think, I'm trying to remember which high fashion, I think it's either Fendi. Fendi is actually going down the route of replacing its leather wear with mushroom made leather. So it's, which is brilliant because it will be 100% sustainable. And yes, banana fibers is actually a really, really good natural resource. There is lack of funding, like with everything new, it's really seen as a startup, as an enterprise. So my suggestion would be looking outside the country. So whether it is something that you want to push in India, inevitably what you want is to engage large funding bodies like hedge funds from Europe and the US to put a lot of money into that. There is definitely a massive shift over the past 2-3 years, I would say, towards natural fibers. So there's now more money putting into that. And you also have to remember that through green investing, one of the priorities for green investments is actually looking at new materials, which are completely 100% sustainable. So banana fibers will fall under that.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, this is a long one. You mentioned the tens of thousands of people made unemployed when shopping stopped in the pandemic. Has anyone in the industry, stroke NGOs around the industry, worked out a plan for what the workers will transition to if and when the big consumers do transform? Is that finished? Their shopping habits. Can you figure that one out?
Yeah, I think that's really the big question. The problem with a lot of companies, and I'm not talking about the high-end ones, you know, we're talking about the ones that dominate the high street. So whether it's the Zara's, the H&M's, the Primark, well, Primark's being my my not to go entity. Their pattern, their relationship with their employees was always on a 0-hour contract anyway. So they always trying to maintain limited liability in terms of their workforce. Their relationship with their supply chain actually is even worse, because the way that companies like this work is they don't sign contracts. They basically say, I want 100,000 pieces of this piece of clothing. They then call somebody in Bangladesh or India. They get the best deal and they make an arrangement. But so there's no longevity. There's no relationship with the final producer in the supply chain. Therefore, they can cut off at any point. It's much, much easier for them to cut that off. In terms of the workforce, I suppose, if you want to look at it in the UK, all these people that have been left unemployed, there is really no plan from the companies themselves to do anything about it. And I think that's also where the government comes into question, because there is no pressure from the government to enforce the companies to behave in a more ethical fashion or behave in a more, well, appropriate. You know, we are talking about a living wage, which exists in other industries, but that is the one big issue with the fashion industry, is because it's so unregulated that it's very hard to implement any regulatory system to force any of the companies to abide by their obligations to their employees. NGOs are trying to push. I mean, obviously they're lobbying governments, they're lobbying the companies, but they are really limited. Personally, I think the only way we're going to see a shift is actually from pressure from the consumer, because the only thing that companies will respond to is actually the consumer. When you stop buying T-shirts from Primark, that's when they're going to feel, you know, the pain, because they depend on, you know, 1 million T-shirts being sold in a week So once that stops, that's when we'll force certain companies to reevaluate the way they function and operate, and hopefully slowly diminish and kind of get them out of the market, cut them off of the market.
Okay, so Diana says, are all high street brands inherently bad, or are some worse than others? E.g., are cheaper ones such as Primark worse than brands considered more high-end like Zara, Marks and Spencers, etc.?
Yes. Brands like Primark, you have to remember, are fairly new compared to like the M&S and the Zaras who've been around for a few decades. So you can always see which brands are the most, the worst, is the ones that have appeared the last 20 years. So instantly you see the brands that emerged the past 20 years tend to be the ones who are engaged into fast fashion. So whether it's the Primark, Zara started off well, but very quickly went down the wrong route, or H&M, they're the ones that have always based their business model on fast fashion, and that's why it worked for them. And that's why it's important to question and be more conscious, and I think it'd be more informed about the brands that you support. The same way that I would say, just because somebody says that they are sustainable nowadays doesn't necessarily mean that they are. There's a lot of, and again, I'm going to use H&M as an example because they came up with recently an eco collection, of what they call a sustainable collection. My question is, why does it have to be a collection? Because if you are implementing sustainable practices, then that should reflect throughout your whole product. It shouldn't be just a collection for this year. So always question things like that. When you see a brand or a high street shop that only has a small collection of sustainable produce, then that is definitely questionable. And also look at brands that they've been around. I mean, Marks and Spencer, they've been around for a long time. So they've had a good relationship, both with their workforce as well as, they have been proactive from the point of view of environmental initiatives. So yes, you shouldn't compare them to the Primark. So there's definitely a difference on these brands. So I would say on the bad end is like the Primarks, all of Arcadia Group, like the Top Shop, Top Man, Top everything, which tend to be, they were driven and they are very much the representation of fast fashion. If anybody's interested, and I don't know if any of you have seen it, there was a movie made, I think it was 2 years ago, last year, called Greed, and it's with Steve Coogan, plays this multi-billionaire retailer. I'm not going to say who he's representing, but I think everybody can figure it out. It's a really good film. It just highlights exactly how the fashion industry has changed so dramatically over the past 20 years. And another great documentary about the fashion industry is called True Cost, which really actually highlights the problem with the whole industry.
So Daphne, if one of us has a favorite brand that we really love, what do we have to do in order to interrogate them, in order to find out whether they're really good people? Even if they say they are, how do we find out whether they really are?
I think this will come out through, looking at websites of the NGOs like Fashion Revolution, like you said, The Ethical Consumer, Remake. They highlight the brands that are doing the right thing in that sense. But it's also about, you have the right as the consumer, because, as they always say, the consumer has always the right to ask the question, ask them about their supply chain, ask them about where that t-shirt is coming from. There is a push now within a lot of brands where they actually they have to put in a tag the whole, sort of like the roadmap of how that t-shirt was made, from the original source, where it started, where it was created, and how it was transported to the final destination. So that is almost like an indicator of, are you comfortable with that, with a journey? And that kind of asks brands to become more transparent and accountable about the product they're putting out there on the high street. So asking that question, it doesn't hurt. You have every right to do that. And it's questioning the brands themselves is the way forward. But the big thing is also about lobbying our government. It's quite sad, and I'm kind of annoyed with the UK government because they haven't done anything in relation to this industry. There's a lot of interest from within the industry for self-regulation, but at the end of the day, it needs to be external. Regulation and legal structure needs to come from a national government, from the international organizations. So there's definitely a need to push for that. I was involved in a different sector, in the extractive sector, almost 15 years ago, about creating a regulatory body within the industry, because again, that was driven from companies within the sector that they felt that they needed to be regulated because there was no government, no external regulatory body. And I think this is what we're seeing now within the fashion industry. It is certain brands within the industry that are thinking, okay, enough is enough. We need to act, we need to behave in a more transparent and accountable way. We need to become more sustainable. So hopefully a combination of them pushing from within the industry with slowly the pressure from the consumer, hopefully will force governments to become a bit more proactive and implement the right systems in place.
Sue?
Daphne, do you, as a sustainable expert or anybody that you might know, actually work in schools to educate the children, the young teenagers who are in fact a vast number of people who use clothing as a means of expressing themselves and live in the throwaway society where it once, wear it twice and out it goes, and who actually frequent Primark and other such companies in very large numbers. Do we need to start at that level to educate them about what in fact their actions are doing to our planet?
Yeah, definitely. And I think the what I call the young generations from like 10 to 25 years, I think that's the Generation Z. They're instrumental about how the fashion industry is going to change and how it's going to move forward. I personally do a lot of talks to schools, and it's very interesting because you can see a shift with a lot of young kids becoming a bit more aware about their fashion. And because it is a big thing, it's a trend, and it's about educating them that the whole Instagram society, I wear one piece of clothing and then I throw it out because I can't possibly be seen on Instagram wearing the same piece of clothing twice. Changing that mentality, because it's not about looking good. And they are really picking up on the fact that the swap shops. I'm engaging here with the university. There's a society they call Sustainable Style. So what we're really pushing forward within the student community is creating swap groups. So you don't want to be seen on Instagram with the same outfit, but your friend that hasn't worn it. So, it's creating these groups of 20, 30 people. They come together and they're swap clothes. So everybody's happy. So you haven't actually bought a new piece of clothing within that group, but you're actually just doing the rounds. And that concept of swap exchange is becoming really, really big. And I think that's a way that kind of maintains what they want, which is actually the whole glamour of being trendy, being seen wearing multiple outfits, but at the same time not buying those outfits. So yes, and with the younger children, I think I've worked on a couple of projects with 12-year-olds that they're very, very passionate about changing the fashion. I grew up, and I'm sure the majority of us, we grew up with having a very different relationship with clothes. which unfortunately, the younger generations don't, because they've never experienced anything. Anybody from 2000 onwards, all they've seen is fast fashion. So it's educating them and trying to tell them that this is just has happened recently. It was never like that. So how we go back into actually re-engaging with our clothes.
Yeah, it's all very, very good points. But I think, yes, I like Sue's point that it's the younger ones we've got to really get to, isn't it? A lot of the people in this group here now listening to you are people who grew up in an era when, you bought something and you wore it for years and years. So we've all got to talk to our children and our grandchildren and get out and give talks in schools. If you're a Rotarian, you know what you've got to do. There are a couple of other quite long questions in the chat, but I think what I'm going to do, Daphne, if that's okay, is to email them to you so that you can give a quick answer, and I can forward it to the people who have asked them, because they're both people that I have email addresses for, because we're coming to the time when we promise that we will close, and I want to make sure that you have a really good send-off, because this has been terrific. We've really, really, well, I should speak for myself, but I've really learned a huge amount from you. I will share on the Speak Up for Our Planet website a lot of the things that you've mentioned, like Remake and Fashion Revolution, so they're all up there for people to find. And I think the questions have shown that people are really quite engaged with this issue. And if it's 10% of carbon emissions, that is serious. We just really need to get on and do something about this. So thank you very, very much indeed. Round of applause, even if you're muted.
Thank you so much.
So much.
It's been a pleasure, and please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer. And if you need presentations, because I've done so many presentations on the issue, you want to share, and it is about sharing with your friends, family, your children, grandchildren, spreading the word. That's what I always tell people, because even if one from your audience picks up on the thing that is important, that's all that matters. If you manage to touch one person, then you've succeeded.
Yeah. I think your point is a good one. We need to make sharing and swapping trendy. We need to make sure that it's great to be seen in something that you've altered or that you've bought in a secondhand shop or whatever. That's got to be what becomes cool. So yes, please can you share your presentation? Yes, I will be putting this on to YouTube. In a couple of days, this will be on YouTube and the link will be available on our website. But possibly, Daphne, people might like it if your slides were actually available separately, because if they've been to this talk, perhaps they don't want to sit through the talk again, but they would just like to be reminded of the slides. Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course. I can forward the slides.
Well,
but also,
I already have them.
Yeah, okay, perfect. But also if you want information that I've talked through, some of the statistics, some of the things, I can write it up and send that forward for anyone who might find that useful to accompany the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.